Well, I want to welcome everybody to our second Newman lecture, our virtual Newman lecture series here at Our Lady of Wisdom. For those who don't know me, I'm Father Bryce Sibley. I'm the pastor here. And the Newman lecture series has been going on for a while. Wisdom has a great tradition of lecturers coming to talk about that intersection between Catholic faith, the public square, and different areas that are focuses within the context of study at a university. And they're usually speakers like ours today with a deep knowledge of their field, offer insight as Catholic professionals. And this year, with the election approaching, civil issues that have come to the fore with COVID, I thought it'd be apropos to host a series of speakers, which will be held each Thursday, 12 noon, so you can join in from home or office. And speakers this year really trying to focus on different aspects of our Catholics' social teaching. We talked about responsibility and participation last week with Donald Anderson. And then this week, we are going to deal with the topic of Marxism and sort of economic and social teaching of the church. And so I guess like we did last week, I want to jump right in and have the pleasure to introduce, just like I did last week, a very good friend of mine, Dr. Kevin Roberts. I'm going to read his little bio here. Dr. Kevin Roberts is an executive director of the Texas Public Policy Foundation, lifelong educator. Dr. Roberts earned his PhD in American history from the University of Texas, thereafter serving as a history professor and ultimately starting his own K-12 school, the John Paul the Great Academy here in Lafayette. He was then hired as president of Wyoming Catholic College, which the New York Times described as being full of cowboy Catholics for refusing federal student loans and grants. And he's since then given a number of talks, well known, and now working with the Texas Public Policy Foundation. It's a scholar of America's founding. He approaches every public policy issue with the desire to increase self-governance and to decrease government outreach naturally, though he oversees all of the foundation's policy efforts. He gravitates to educational reform. So we're very happy to have my good friend, Dr. Roberts, friends now for, we're getting close to 35 years. And hey, we'll turn it over to you, Dr. Roberts. Don't say too many bad things about how I behaved in high school.
No, I won't do that, Father Bryce, but good to be with you and for all of you who are taking some time out of your busy day. Thanks for joining us. Thanks for being friends of the Raging Cajun Catholics. My family and I were very happy parishioners there, even though Father Bryce was the pastor. And you're in good hands. And all kidding aside, it's being a UL alumnus as well, Lafayette native and Lafayette High School alum. It's good to be with you. A lot of the talks that I give are talks that have to be non-sectarian, and that's okay. I mean, there's a place for that in America's pluralistic society. But all of that to say, I've been looking forward to talking to a Catholic audience, and as a Catholic and someone who cares deeply about the issue at hand. And so, what I'm going to do today is talk about Marxism and why it's a problematic philosophy, to say the least, for Catholics. And yet, I want to do so in a way that is neither overly academic, although if you're interested in that, there are certainly some academic treatments of Marxism's trouble that you should look at. I'll mention them, nor overly belittling of people who find it appealing. And the reason for the latter point is that we are experiencing a revival in the appeal of Marxism. And I think that we have to understand, let's just presume that many of you understand there are problems with Marxism. We can start a conversation with someone who finds Marxism appealing this way. You're an idiot for believing in Marxism. And then they're just going to close their ears. Rather, as Catholics, as people who try to be persuasive in other ways, we ought to drill down to the philosophical underpinnings of Marxism that create problems for anyone. And so that's what I want to do today. The second thing I want to do, because we all take our faith seriously, is posit just from the beginning that Marxism absolutely contravenes what we believe as Catholics. But rather than just say that and take it as a given, I want to offer a step-by-step analysis of why that's true. In the spirit, especially given that we are in an election year, and of course, I'm not going to say anything that's overtly political, although it is what I do for a living, that we are armed with the understanding of why this is a problem for us. And not politically, not even economically, but spiritually and philosophically and theologically, this is a significant problem for us as Catholics. And so if we look at public opinion polls, we know that a growing percentage of Americans have some affinity for some form of socialism. I'll talk a little bit about the differences between socialism and Marxism and communism, but let's just take that for face value. That means that Americans are intuiting, they're seeing out there in society something that's broken. And I think that we also ought to understand that it is possible to believe two things simultaneously: that Marxism is problematic and that there are some things wrong in society economically that we need to fix. And so I'm hopeful that in our discussion that follows my points today, that we'll be able to talk about that. You can see in the European Union, the parliament itself of Europe, which Britain decided to leave, that Marxism, communism, some strands of neo-Marxism are not just present, but explicit. And this is problematic, not just at the government level, but as I will talk about and hope to emphasize at the level of the individual human person. So let's get started with this. And let me say that the way I'm going to approach the conversation today is to walk through 8 discrete myths about Marxism. And I don't want to create a straw man about each of those myths. I don't want to easily tear down those particular myths. We want to give the other position the legitimate understanding that it has. And so in order to frame those 8 myths, let me begin by saying what Marxism is. Just very, very simple definition. Marxism ultimately is a philosophy. It's a historical and even economic theory that leads to an economic system of communism. Communism in its purest form, as practiced, for example, in the Soviet Union, I would argue until recently in China. China has changed slightly in the last few years. Communism is a system by which all property is publicly owned. Government owns the property, and each person works and is paid according to their abilities and needs. And that sounds, I will grant, kind of sweet on the basis. But in that, as we unpack that definition about public property or property being publicly owned and everyone being paid according to their abilities and needs, be looking for, as we walk through these myths, private property and what we understand is the importance of private property, especially as it connects to initiative by human people, by human persons. And then also be looking for the effect on human persons of communism, especially when it comes to the dignity of work, what one scholar recently has called the earned success that comes from work. And of course, that earned success, that dignity exists and happens regardless of whether one is a blue-collar worker or a very successful white-collar worker. And I think we also have to pay attention to how this process of a communist form of government, a Marxist form of government comes into being. So what I'll do for the next spell is walk through these 8 myths, and then as I get to the end of that, sort of assess where we are as a country, but particularly where we are as Catholics in the United States, trying to make sense not just of this revitalized Marxism, but very importantly to me, because I don't just want to talk about problems, what we can do to solve it. And so let's jump into the myths. The first myth about Marxism is that history shows that Marxism has worked. In fact, you can read almost any mainstream American publication today, from a newspaper like the New York Times to long considered legitimate journals like the Atlantic. And there is at least a strain in many of these articles in the last few years that perhaps there's a better economic system than whatever it is that the United States has. And there is, in the writings of some of their reporters, an underlying assumption that communism or some form of Marxism or socialism must be good. Well, as a historian, I do 2 things when I read that. The first is I want to go to history and ask myself the question, well, how can I prove that assertion or that assumption to be true? And secondly, delve into the history and try to find examples of Marxist countries that have worked. And it is literally true. That's not an overstatement, that there has never been an example of Marxism working when applied at the level of the nation state. In other words, there could be some local example in a village or a city, maybe even a county somewhere or a province in the world I'm not aware of where Marxism or communism has worked. But if you make the claim that history shows that Marxism has worked, you would not be 50% wrong, you would be 100% wrong. And you look at the Soviet Union, many of us, presumably, joining today were around to see the demise of the Soviet Union. Many of you joining, thankfully, were born after the fall of the Soviet Union. And so it's incumbent on people like me with as little hair as I have to explain to you in the spirit of a teacher that living through the last decades of the Soviet Union or the last years of the Soviet Union is very clarifying for those of us who are around. You, however, if you're younger, the proverbial millennial, and I don't have a bad attitude about millennials, by the way, I think y'all are the future of this country in a very good way, then you need to spend some time reading about what caused the demise of the Soviet Union. I'll unpack that for us today. Obviously, we still have the communist government of China. China has opened up a couple of aspects of its market that make it a little more complicated example, but the fact that it's done so proves that communism wasn't working. In fact, to the extent that we have some records from the Chinese Communist Party that have become available to us in the last 30 and 40 years, we know that since the late 1970s, the Chinese believed that they needed to catch up to the United States. And the way to do so was to engage in a system of trade that mirrored more our free market system than their communist system. So that's a long-winded way of saying that the pure communist system in China starting in 1949, which began to change in the 1970s and 80s, simply didn't work. There are aspects of that too that I'll cover regarding the human person that actually are very clear contraventions of Catholic teaching. And then we also have the example of Cuba, still around, it still calls itself communist, but with the political demise, the retirement of Fidel Castro, its longtime dictator, we know that the communist system in Cuba did not work as either. In addition to that, you go to any encyclopedia. I don't usually recommend going to Wikipedia, but just for kicks, go to Wikipedia or to Google and put in Marxism or communism countries and see the long list of countries that were formerly communist that no longer are. It's dozens and dozens and dozens of countries. Beyond the three examples that probably come to mind that I mentioned, the Eastern Bloc countries of Eastern Europe, countries that the Soviets, not coincidentally, forced to be communist. The countries in Africa, many of which are still suffering through the transition from an end to communism to more of a market-oriented economy. And very importantly for us in the United States, the countries of South America going through that same transition. In fact, if you're interested in reading more or learning more about this history, and I'm going to give you some suggested readings at the end of my comments, but let me also suggest a fantastic series that you can find on Amazon called Line of Separation. It is about a fictional town, Tanbach, in Eastern Germany, but the story really, while in a fictional town, is very real, and it's based on the history we know of the very end of World War II, when the heroic soldiers of the United States and Great Britain liberated Nazi Germany and came to march into these little towns. And this story, Line of Separation, which goes over 2 or 3 seasons, I think, tells the story of the Soviets coming in and taking over that town and turning it into a communist economy and a communist form of government. The interesting thing, which is profound about this story that unfolds in this series, is that the town is split in two, much like we know Berlin was, between the West and the East, between the free and the Marxist. But in this little town, this little village, Tanbach, on one side of the river that splits the town, it is pro-Western. There is a market economy. People are very happy and cheerful. And then on the eastern side of that river, the Marxist side, the Soviet side, you see the very serious deterioration, not just of people's economic well-being, but very importantly, this is a key point for us as Christians, their well-being as humans. And I think it's a very unbiased portrayal of what we know history teaches us. So I could go on about the lessons of history when it comes to Marxism, but I think I've said enough regarding that myth that history simply does not show that it's worked. In fact, it shows us the exact opposite. The second myth is that Marxism is the most efficient system of economics. And I will say, to give some credence to at least the first level of that claim, you could make an argument, at least in theory, that Marxism sounds very efficient. If a government owns all property and is distributing salaries, wages based on someone's ability and needs, then there is a certain efficiency that comes from that. I would argue, however, that in the same way that thoughtful Catholics ought to critique the efficiency of the market, they should critique the efficiency of Marxism in theory, and it's for the same reason. Efficiency is very unhuman. It simply does not take into account enough what we know about us as individuals. We're not just mere cogs in the wheel of some economic system, whether it be Marxism or whether it be unfettered market-oriented economies. We are people, and we're people with souls who desire a relationship with our Lord. And I'll develop that as well later in my comments. But for now, know that once again, we would turn to history and we would look at the data to the extent that we can get it from these very closed communist countries in history and look at their gross domestic product. You know, one of the measures that economists across the world, at least in the last 90 or 100 years, have used to determine the size and health of a country's economy. There's just no gross domestic product data that exists that would point to Marxism in practice being a very efficient system of economics. Because if it were in practice, we would see gross domestic products increasing decade over decade over decade. We did not see that in the Soviet Union. We certainly didn't see it in Cuba. We definitely have not seen it in Vietnam. The fact that those formerly communist countries in Eastern Europe and Africa and South America have moved away from those systems ought to suggest that there certainly was an amazing lack of efficiency economically in the system. So once again, history is a very important guide. There's another aspect of this too, that unfortunately history bears out. And that is that in the scenario in which communist countries in the 20th century were seeing their gross domestic product shrink, their economies become smaller. To put it on the sidewalk level, as I like to say, opportunities for individuals becoming less present. They have to use some other tool in their toolbox, as it were, to have power in the geopolitical landscape. And that tool that they turn to is military power. And so they end up spending a very disproportionate percentage of their gross domestic product on military power. That's precisely why and how the Soviet Union could be an economically deteriorating country while also being a very grave military threat to the United States. It's precisely why the Chinese could be seeing in their mostly communist system a very uneven economic growth, while also being a very grave military threat to the United States and to the world. And obviously, in those scenarios, in any country, if there is, as there was in the last years of the Soviet Union, 30 and 40% of the gross domestic product being spent on military affairs. The United States, just for contrast, I think we're like 1.4% in the last 4 years. Then you're going to see an attendant demise in freedom for individuals. Those become not just militaristic states, but totalitarian ones. And to continue to connect the dots here, that happens because of the lack of economic health as a result of communism, of Marxism. And the last thing I would say on this point before moving on to the third myth about Marxism is a wonderful comment from Joseph Ratzinger before he was Pope Benedict XVI. And this is in his wonderful book, the first suggested reading that I would give you, Turning Point for Europe. Slim volume, but an excellent analysis of this transitional period we've experienced in our lives, about Europe, about Western civilization generally. And the demise of Marxist countries is a key part of that. This is what Ratzinger said: those whom embodied the system, the Marxist system, gradually lost faith in it. We see this in the Soviet Union starting in the 60s, definitely reaching a fever pitch in the 1980s. We see it right now in China, in Cuba, in Venezuela, in Vietnam. But to continue with Ratzinger, those whom embodied the system gradually lost faith in it, so that it kept going for a long time, no longer out of conviction, however, but only through the self-maintenance of power. And you see, that's the other thing, the self-maintenance of power that has happened historically in communist regimes. And that leads me to the third myth, which is that Marxism prevents an unjust accumulation of wealth and property. In fact, one only need to look at the oligarchs of the Soviet Union to know that communism in practice, as history shows us unfailingly, that is, without exception, leads to an accumulation of wealth and property. And that wealth and property, of course, becomes sources of great power. And we see this in China today. To the extent we know something about China, we know that the leaders of the Chinese Communist Party have been accreting power over their last several years in control through the country's vast natural resources. And of course, as we also know, if you follow some news about unfair trade practices, basically stealing the labor of people. And it certainly would be nice if more people in the United States who like to criticize America would spend some time criticizing those really evil and unjust conditions for so many workers in China. I could go on about that and offer some more examples, but will emphasize the point that the third myth of Marxism, that it prevents the unjust accumulation of wealth and property, sounds like it might be true because of the very definition of Marxism and communism, where there's the government owning property and distributing wages. But in fact, once again, history shows that not to be the case. I'll say, just as a very brief addendum to that, the modern world shows that is not the case as well, that is in fact a myth. Just look at modern day Korea, what's going on in Venezuela, what continues to go on in Cuba. The fourth myth is one that also will reflect a transition in my comments from myths that are kind of at the macro level to myths that are about the micro level. What this looks like, what Marxism looks like from the standpoint of us as individual persons. And really, in a lot of ways, as Catholics who are interested in evangelizing others to whatever the truth about a subject may be, I think this is where the rubber meets the road. And so I'm going to spend some time on these. This fourth myth is that Marxism is good for the human person. And once again, I'll just say that if you're tuning in today because you've been intrigued by what you've heard in the political sphere, maybe something you've read about socialism or about socialist countries, and you think that, gosh, Dr. Roberts, that has to be better than this chaos we have in the United States. Let me just submit to you that the best way to understand that this is a myth, that Marxism is good for the human person, is to embrace what we know from the church, to turn to church teachings. And we know that the church aims to guide our consciences when it comes to our political behavior, but not dictate for us how we behave politically. And so, in other words, these church teachings about how devastating Marxism is for the human person, I find the most poignant. Today is the feast day of St. John Paul II, someone for whom I have a great admiration. And in fact, my family has a great devotion. That's why we named the school we started with Father Sibley, John Paul the Great Academy. There are very few people in history who have done more to amplify the message that Marxism's greatest evil is for the human person than John Paul II. And so let me turn, for example, to the Catechism. And I'll just read this paragraph so you know that I'm not filtering this with some sort of conservative bias. This is paragraph 2429, coming from the great tradition of the church. Everyone has the right of economic initiative. Everyone should make legitimate use of his talents to contribute to the abundance that will benefit all and to harvest the just fruits of his labor. He should seek to observe regulations issued by legitimate authority for the sake of the common good. And there, I think you see emphasized the importance of initiative, that aspect that each of us has hardwired to do work, to do well. Also, for that matter, to have the opportunity to fail and to learn from that. We know that we do that because of original sin, even spiritually. And we recover from that through sacramental confession. Same is true in the economic setting, at least as the church sees it. The church isn't here calling for unfettered, unregulated market economy, because we know what happens is very similar accumulation of property in the hands of a few. I'll address that momentarily. The church also is definitely not calling for something that's Marxist or communist, even though some purposefully misread church teaching along those lines. In fact, what the church is saying is that the emphasis on whatever economic system we have ought to be on the individual worker. And the reason for that is because we understand that our salvation rests upon our relationship with Jesus Christ, obviously with the sacraments that the church provides along the way. So the dignity of work is something that comes from us using that initiative, and we simply can't use that initiative in a communist system. It shuts off the desire we have to excel, the desire we have to succeed. So even though it sounds very nice and sweet that we're going to just simply distribute everyone or the potential salary equally, we know, number one, that hasn't happened in practice because the leaders simply take a lot of the money. And number two, we know even if they didn't, that would begin to undermine our desires to be successful, to be excellent. And so this leads me to a very crucial point. In fact, one of the headlines that I would write for you, and that is that Marxism is bad because the individual in Marxism is simply a tool of society. He's a cog in the wheel. In fact, to turn to Ratzinger again from the same source, he says, an individual who has come into being in and through socialization in a communist government cannot at all be conceived of independently of society. In other words, and this goes back to the original writings of Marx and Engels in the 1800s, they believed that the ideal man, their term, the ideal man, could only be created through this long class struggle from the proletariat, the oppressed working class, reaching this pinnacle, but a pinnacle that for you and me doesn't sound like much of a pinnacle, because it's a peak that has nothing to do with a spiritual awakening, with a relationship with our Lord, for that matter, even with the ability to practice religion. In fact, it is a pinnacle, so to speak, of this class struggle, which only makes individuals cogs in the wheel of the communist system. And that leads me to the fifth myth, which is that Marxism is good for society. In fact, there's an addendum to this. Marxism is much better for society, especially when contrasted to the hyper-individualism of the United States. And look, I'll readily grant to you, as a conservative in the mold or the school of thought of Edmund Burke and Russell Kirk, both of whom place a great emphasis on conservatism starting in our individual relationships, our communities. It's very Aristotelian in its thinking, that we do have a lot of hyper-individualism in the United States. But once again, I would submit to you that you can understand this being a myth about Marxism, that it's good for society, and also critique that hyper-individualism in the United States. Once again, the truth is very much in the middle. The reason, as history shows us, Marxism is not good for society is because of this deleterious effect on individuals. Of course, writ large, has a very negative effect on society. Government begins replacing the relationships that each of us should have to another, not just one-on-one, but also in, as Aristotle or de Tocqueville would say, the little platoons of human society, our nuclear families, our extended kin, villages, if you will, neighborhood associations for you in Lafayette and the surrounding area. These are where we ought to be having those kinds of relationships. And because of the hyper centralization of power, of government, of economic decisions in a Marxist framing, in a Marxist regime, we know that it's not good for society. Next, Marxism is a pure philosophy. That's the next myth of society. And this is where I could probably spend an entire 40-minute period talking about that, but I won't. I'll just lay the groundwork so that we can get to question and answer period here pretty soon. Marxism, in fact, is the exact opposite. It's a philosophy that's fraught with a lot of difficulties. But I will grant, for the person who wants to be as unbiased as possible, that Marxism is the most pure philosophy if you want to go through life being a material determinist. Material determinism is a fancy phrase for believing that everything that happens in life comes from something that we can touch. So a material determinist would say that the reason I behave the way I do, socially, culturally, politically, is because I woke up this morning in Austin, Texas. And the people in Austin, the terrain in Austin, the economic opportunities in Austin, all dictated what I do. Now, granted, they all affect what I do, but we know as Christians, and especially as Roman Catholics, that there's something very important upstream from what is material. And whatever is material certainly is not deterministic. It doesn't predestine us. It doesn't predetermine for us what we're going to do. And that is God. And of course, the religious practices we understand as Catholics surrounding God. And this is where I would just point you to Ratzinger in particular, to a little bit lesser extent, John Paul II, who completely undresses Marxists on this basis of their material determinism. In fact, I'll make one additional comment about this before moving on to the last couple of myths and wrapping up. And that is that one of the most egregious signs, most egregious examples of this material determinism of Marxists is that they believe every important social change happens politically. Every important social change happens in the political sphere. And all I have to say to you, this is a completely nonpartisan, bipartisan comment, is that surely none of us in this conversation today would submit that everything important should happen in a political atmosphere, whether someone's liberal or conservative or libertarian or anarchist. We know that the political world, the political arena by its very nature is imperfect. And so I think that at this time where politics is very much on our minds, we understand the limitations, to say the least, of that thinking. The seventh myth is that, and it's fair for someone to say this, Dr. Roberts, okay, I can concede most of what you've said about this first six myths, but surely there has to be a new form of Marxism that's working. Surely the seventh myth goes, a neo-Marxism has to be working somewhere in the world. And I would just turn that back on you and be grateful for the question, because we need to be critical about the assumptions we're making, and say, turn to Vietnam, turn to Venezuela, turn to Cuba, turn to China. And if you're willing to leave the United States right now and move to one of those countries, then I will grant you the point. It really is that simple. Do your own research. And I'm not saying that pointing the finger at you in some sort of accusatory way, but do the research for yourself and ask yourself that question. What is it that's different between those places, which are forms of neo-Marxist economies, and what we're practicing here in the United States? And I would imagine that most of us, if not all of us, would want to stay right where we are. The last myth is that, and it's the most important for us, and in a lot of ways, the most important for Catholics, that Marxism works with religion, especially Catholicism. In fact, we've seen a lot of this surrounding the early days of Pope Francis's papacy, because he was such a poignant critic of what's called liberation theology, something that is not unique to South America, but has been very profound there. This belief that you can fuse Marxist economic ideology with Catholicism in particular, that in fact, Catholicism is, from the standpoint of the Marxists, the perfect way of thinking, and they use it as a way of thinking, to emphasize that the oppressed can overcome. And there's even citing of the book of Exodus for this, in much the same way that slaves in the early United States turned to the book of Exodus for some sort of hope. Let me just cut to the chase here in the interest of time and say that that is a very dangerous way of thinking. It's dangerous because of the same limitations we see in other aspects of Marxism. Ultimately, what that does is relegate not just our religious practices, not just our church teaching, but our relationship with Jesus Christ to the back seat behind the economic theory that there's going to be a class struggle of the proletariat toward freedom. The second thing it does, and Ratzinger is just beautifully eloquent on this, is that it equates a secular freedom, sort of like my freedom to walk into this office building today, with the most profound freedom that we know we can only experience in and through Jesus Christ. In fact, what Scripture is very, very careful to use as the word redemption. There's a section in another of Ratzinger's books in which he addresses this, and I'll quote this and then I'll wrap up and take your questions. He's addressing this point, this limitation of Marxism, and of course responding to liberation theology. He says, the suffering proletariat is the redeemer of the world in the eyes of the Marxists. But this suffering of the proletariat has to be accomplished in their minds concretely in the active form of the class struggle only. Only in this way can it become redemptive and lead to the downfall of the ruling class and the equality of all mankind. If the cross of Christ, Ratzinger continues, is a suffering for the passion of the proletariat as the Marxists view it, the work of one individual for the whole, this Marxist passion is essentially the activity of a mass organized as a party on behalf of itself. That, I think, is a crucial critique for us to understand. I'm hopeful that walking through these eight myths has been helpful for you. In the Q&A, I'll give you some other suggestions about reading. And I always like to end by suggesting some solutions. And I think solutions start with being better read, not just for you in the audience, but for me. I know that Father Sibley keeps a very serious regimen of reading about this topic in particular. And I would say that perhaps it's never been more timely for us to do so. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Dr. Roberts. That was fantastic. I expected nothing less. So we do have some time. If you notice at the bottom of the page, there's a place for questions and answers. If you just type them up, I'll do my best to go ahead and get to them. I think we just do sort of a little dialogue where I bring up questions and we kind of make this as easygoing as we can. So, Dr. Roberts, first question, what are, let's do some common Marxist ideas, mindsets, or dispositions that Catholics of goodwill today, particularly within, let's say, the past several years, commonly and or accidentally fall into?
I think a couple. That's a great question. The first is that, and I understand the appeal here, at least on the fundamental level. The first is that Marxism sounds like something that's more equitable, that is more just, that, and there are multiple strands of Marxism. So someone asking that question, a Catholic of goodwill, might say, well, I don't have to talk about the Soviet Union. Maybe I can use Marxism to build a better economic system. That seems to work with church teaching about remembering the poor, remembering the vulnerable, in fact, giving them a preferential option, as some people like to say. And I grant all of that. The problem is that history shows that it has been impossible to implement that. The second thing I would say about that, before we move on to a follow-up, Father, is that Catholics of goodwill know that there's something wrong with our American system. In fact, you and I talk often about examples of this. And in fact, I just pardon the minute of a little bit of a personal story here. I lead the largest think tank outside Washington, D.C. We're dyed-in-the-wool conservatives. Doesn't mean someone listening has to be a conservative, just letting you know why this story is crucial. A lot of times I'm doing interviews with the media, and these media folks are shocked that I say ExxonMobil, Amazon, all these, not just Fortune 500, but Fortune 50 companies are evil. And they're evil because they've forgotten the first responsibility that corporations have according to church teaching. And that is to address the common good, to remember the common good. And that's the context in which Catholics of goodwill are looking for an alternative. They're looking for a solution. What I would submit, and then I'll be quiet, is, and I'm a low tech kind of guy, Father, so I can't share my screen, that we understand this spectrum, that on the left here is economic freedom. This would be unfettered market behavior. And then on the right is economic order. Actually, that's Marxism, because there is complete economic order in Marxism. I'm just suggesting that as Catholics of goodwill, let's build something here in the middle. Some economists might call that a managed economy, basically based on free market behavior at the individual level with regulations. That's essentially what we have in the United States. And it may be that we need to spend more time looking at some of the excesses among our largest corporations.
No, that's a great way of putting it. And I have a question of my own to bring up, but I'm gonna before I get to that, you gave the little diagram right there. One of the questions we have here is about, like, we generally say, well, okay, if you're liberal, you're to the left, sort of socialist. If you're conservative, you're to the right. Well, how would you, to help people understand this a little bit better and using that, where would you on this like spectrum place free market capitalism? Where would you place what the Catholic position should be, and where, let's say, general socialism or even radical Marxism would be?
Yeah, good.
Left to right spectrum.
Yeah, on the political left to right spectrum is what you're asking.
Yeah, correct. Yeah.
So, and that's a different spectrum. The little chart that I just showed actually represents what classical liberalism is, which only confuses even me, and I study this. But to your question, which is an even better framing, I think, because we're using a spectrum we're all familiar with. Liberals are on the left, conservatives on the right, and it's very obvious. It's empirically true that people who are politically left of center in the United States are gravitating towards socialism. In fact, the Pew Research study of earlier this summer showed that now a majority of people who are politically liberal in the United States believe that socialism is a better form of economic order than is capitalism. People on the right tend to gravitate toward capitalism, although I'm very careful not to use that word, because capitalism in its purest form, philosophically, actually argues for a certain efficiency that comes from a large percentage of wealth and property being held by a few. I think those of us who grew up, and as all of you do now, live in South Louisiana, know well that the real liberty that someone enjoys, the real conservatism that someone enjoys from the free market, comes from small businesses. It comes from the individual decisions we're making in the market. And that is right in the middle of socialism and capitalism, because what helps to order that liberty we have to earn a lot of money is regulation at the local level, at the parish level, at the state level, at the federal level. I might argue as a conservative that we have too much regulation, but in fact, as we know from church teaching, what I read, there needs to be some level of regulation, some level of management to ensure that in fact the vulnerable are not left on the peripheries and have an opportunity at least to share in what we know will be the abundance of our human initiative exercised freely.
Yeah, so I want to go back to something you said earlier about the common good and how Catholics of goodwill care about the common good. How can we address this issue of the common good in a culture that does not recognize universal values or objective truth? Because, well, my good is my truth, is what's true for me. Your truth is what's true for you. Well, the same thing with good. How can we recognize a common good if no one can agree on what's good in the first place?
Yeah, that question is always timely for us as Catholics. It's particularly timely on this topic. And the reason I'm getting animated in my response is I think that the way that Catholics of goodwill can begin to make inroads on this huge obstacle of people believing that everyone has their own truth is actually this issue of the economic ordering of society. What I mean by that, Father Bryce, is that we have, you might call the third way. Catholics have the third way of thinking economically. And that third way is that we understand that we have not just a right, and the way Americans understand that, we have a desire to use our initiative to go make as much of an income as we can. But we also understand that twinned with that, and it doesn't have to be in some sort of tension with that, it ought to be wedded to it, is a desire that our process of exercising our own initiative to make a salary, and for that matter, to make a really big profit, is also something that's furthering the common good. You have some excellent examples of parishioners in your parish. I certainly have in donors to the foundation I lead who are doing this. The point is, both the political left in the United States today and the political right in the United States today are having the wrong conversation. They're definitely having the wrong conversation in the middle of this presidential debate. The conversation moving forward has to be centered on the American worker. And so I would commend to your audience and to your parishioners a wonderful book by a scholar named Orrin Cass. I know Orrin, I don't know if he's Catholic, but it's called The Once and Future Worker. And what Cass is arguing for is that once we get past November 3rd, whoever wins, this is what we need to be working on as Catholics, is we've got to be reframing our understanding of the market economy to be focused on the American worker. Because if we do so, we're necessarily going to be talking about the common good. To come full circle with your question, the last point I would make is, if we succeed in doing that, or even part of that, I think we begin persuading people from their misunderstandings about having their own truths, because a light bulb will go off in their minds that, gosh, there may be something to how Catholics see the world, and we just have to do a better job of articulating our position on economic order.
Well, that's a great answer. Thanks. Another question is brought up. So we hear very often, again, I'm not talking about political candidates, but political parties. Well, you know, the abortion issue is not the only issue. There are other very important issues, most of them who fall into sort of the social justice issue.
Sure.
And so the argument is like, basically, well, the Republicans are pro-life, but the Democrats care about these other issues, so therefore one should vote that way. Is it fair to say that just because some political parties say they care about the poor, or more in conformity with Catholic social teaching, would you agree or believe that, from what you know of both parties, is that a fair thing to say, that let's say one party is more in line with the Catholic teaching because they care about the poor, or they care about social justice?
Well, in a word, no. I would not say that that is accurate. And let me give a little more of an answer, but also with the caveat, for your sake and for my sake, leading a 501c3 is not intended to be partisan. In fact, I'm as much a critic of the Republican Party as I am of the Democrat Party. Having said that, the Democrat Party, for us as Catholics, deserves the gravest criticism that we could ever offer about human life. And I think we all understand that. To give the most honest portrayal of that thoughtful Catholic, that well-intentioned Catholic who's making the claim you mentioned, that in this case, the Democratic Party is more in line with church teaching, I would argue that a lot of things, but one point, in line with some of the commentary I had about the myths. Take what the Democratic Party, or let's just say political liberals in the United States today, want to do to its logical extension. We study this a lot at the Texas Public Policy Foundation. It's called the Green New Deal. I'm all for protecting the environment. You know, my family, like all of people tuning in, we're great stewards of the environment. Catholics are going to be that way. In fact, the businessmen I know are going to do that. They have, in fact, an incentive to do so. So it's not an anti-environmentalism comment at all. It's the opposite. The Green New Deal has nothing to do with climate change. It has nothing to do with so-called environmentalism. It has everything to do with imposing a Marxist ordering of the economy on the United States. Where that has happened at the local level, places like San Antonio, Texas, San Francisco, California, you're already seeing businesses leave. Why is that important? Because businesses provide jobs. Businesses provide us the opportunity to seek employment and then maybe one day decide to go off and start a business of our own. The reason is that regime, which comes out of this political liberalism in the United States, overdoes the regulation. And in fact, they even go to almost wanting to control certain aspects of private property. For example, municipal utilities. This is, and I don't get too far into the weeds, I want to stay at the high level as you framed it, but I think that's the best way for a well-intentioned Catholic who is sort of tempted by that argument that some people make that political liberalism in the United States is more in line with church teaching to think through. It's not the political liberalism of the 1960s. It's the political liberalism of the 21st century, which is governed by elite intellectuals who have trust funds, who would not know earned success and the dignity of work if it hit them upside the head.
That's a great way of putting it. But from that, someone asked, Acts chapter 2, verse 44, it talks about how Christians, early Christians, shared everything in common. What about someone who says, well, the Bible says that they share things in common? Could this be used as a biblical justification for Marxism?
Well, it could be, and it has, and it would be dead wrong, because that biblical justification does not, just think about this logically. Let's just say we're not Catholics, you're not a priest, and I'm not a faithful Catholic layman. And we're just looking at the Bible as a text, and we're putting into this some sort of secular philosophy course. It simply does not follow logically from Acts 2:44 that we ought to be Marxist. What follows logically from Acts 2, I talked to a lot of atheists, which is why I'm putting it this way. It follows from Acts 2:44 that we have some sort of obligation. For our atheist brothers and sisters, we say, well, nature makes us that way. We want to help fellow man. Okay, that's not Marxism. That means that when we wake up tomorrow, we darn well better be sure that we're not just worried about the dollars that are going into our bank account, but that we are attending to the people in need. So for example, for us here in downtown Austin, it's very apparent that the way we apply that wonderful scriptural reminder is to attend to the homeless. Some of the homeless will always be homeless, but it's incumbent on us as we attend to the common good and use some of our private resources, that abundance that came from our initiative, to build organizations that address homelessness. We also know it's far more effective when we as individuals do that rather than centralizing all of that control in the government. And we know that the problem doesn't get fixed. The next thing it does is it prevents us from doing the precise thing that Acts wants us to do, which is to attend to others with our own initiative.
Very good answer. Yeah. We have another question from an anonymous attendee. Is Republican democracy the best political system for Catholics? And is capitalism the only economic system that can work in this system?
Great question. Just to be clear, little r, Republican democracy, and I would just make that even more precise for my purposes, a Republican form of government, little r, is absolutely the best system of government. It is a system of government that puts into perfect balance two aims that are competing always: liberty and order. In fact, we know from George Washington that the greatest thing that the United States has offered to the world is his concept of ordered liberty, putting those things in perfect or near perfect balance. A republic does that. You could make an argument that a very limited monarchy would do the same, but in fact, on this political spectrum you were drawing for us earlier, Father, those are so close they're touching. They're not even first cousins, they're siblings. And so for a Catholic, I think that that's also true, because it gives us the opportunity to exercise our not just our faith, but also in the public square. Economically, to finish, I would say a market-oriented economy rather than capitalism, to make this nuanced but very important distinction for us as Catholics, which is that capitalism infers that we're okay with an oligarchy or an oligopoly being formed. We ought to be just as critical of that, or almost as critical of that, as we are of Marxism. We really need to get back to much more localized, regional forms of exchange so that we can be much more assured that we are attending to the common good.
So you mentioned earlier, we talked a little bit earlier about why Catholics of goodwill maybe are drawn towards Marxism. But one of our attendees asked this question: in today's political environment, much of the Marxist language theory is our word usage is veiled. Can you give us some, what are some of the little ideas of how to recognize it when we see it, to be able to go beyond the words to what's really going on?
And I love that question. So much of the work we do here, beyond the blocking and tackling of policy work, white papers, is looking at vocabulary. And so let me just think right off the bat, and some of these are good words, right? So I'm not saying we don't use them, but just know they've been co-opted by neo-Marxists. And I'm just going to use an example, not a political comment, Father, but a historical one. The Congresswoman from New York, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, is excellent. She is excellent at using this vocabulary to veil her neo-Marxism. Cooperative, working together, worrying about others before ourselves. It's even very Christian language. Some of this comes from some of the liberation theology vocabulary, as you know, from South America. And I just want to be really clear, because if the election goes one way, then we're going to be hearing about, even in Louisiana and in Lafayette, the Green New Deal. The Green New Deal, just that phrase, is perhaps the best example of the veiled vocabulary that Marxists are using. In other words, to put a fine point on it, Father Bryce, if someone in the audience is saying, well, Kevin, I mean, I like the environment. I believe climate change is happening. We got to do something about it. I don't even worry about debating that anymore. Instead, I say, well, what needs to happen is not the Green New Deal, because in fact, what's going to happen is the exact opposite. People are going to regress. We're going to see society retrograde. Why? Because it's a Marxist regime. And I've presented to you the reasons that Marxist regimes have not worked in history. Be very, very wary of any vocabulary that comes out of the Green New Deal.
Okay. I have the question, this is actually mine. It's something that I thought that I had made this my own sort of word for this, but we have a lot of different words for this types of government. We have democracy, we have a monarchy, we have a plutocracy, oligarchy. Would you say that today, just in America at least, that we live in a celebritocracy? So you have to be a celebrity with lots of money in order to get anywhere. And how could we combat that? This driven by the media, driven by social media. What can reasonable people do to combat that?
Yeah, I agree with that 100%. In fact, I'm going to use that word starting today. And I think what I also like about it is, because I spent a lot of time encouraging civil discourse across left and right. I do a lot of talks to audiences that are left of center in an attempt to restore some sort of civility to our discourse, is that's a nonpartisan or a bipartisan comment, right? We all ought to be critiquing that. So for that well-intentioned Catholic who's flirting, with political liberalism because it sounds like it's Catholic, let's agree on the celebrocracy or whatever you call it. First, we have to consume less social media. Doesn't mean we have to be off of it, because it's part of the public square. So we got to be having that fight. That's a transition in thought that I've made because of a debate I lost to you several years ago. We need to consume less of it, especially in our personal lives. And for two reasons. Number one, and I can tell you this because we spend millions of dollars at my foundation every year running digital campaigns to persuade people to our way of thinking. We can manipulate people's thinking because of the algorithms in social media. So if you are participating less, you're going to be manipulating less. The second thing is, what's the opportunity cost of that time we're spending on social media? Most seriously, it's our relationships at home. It's our relationships with our friends. Those are the answer to fighting that. I mentioned very briefly this concept we most recently heard from Alexis de Tocqueville in the early 1800s about the little platoons of society. We get that idea from Aristotle. We are with this concept that you've got to be a celebrity with hundreds of millions of dollars to be in power in this country. We have to get away from that by rebuilding those little platoons, by paying attention to the people who are in our orbit, including people who disagree with us politically. People, when we're leaving Mass, my wife reminds me of this because I'm ready to go home and cook. No, Kevin, these are the people we get to know, even if they have a bumper sticker in their car we disagree with. This is a very long process, however. And so for those of us like you and me, Father, who are very impatient, we have to remind ourselves that we are playing a long game in redeeming this society and rebuilding this culture. But let us not be afraid, to borrow the words of today's patron. Let us remember that it is incumbent on us to go out and be the cheerful warriors. If we don't see the fruit of that today in our lives, know that perhaps our reward, of course, will be in the afterlife, for our kids, for our grandkids, for Americans and Catholics 500 years from now, because we know the church will be here. We have to do that to restore American society.
No, and I think I won't even pose this as a question because we need to wrap up. That ultimately, as bad as things may seem, and as much as Marxism may be making inroads, and we can be worried about the future of our nation, we still need to hope, and there's still reason to hope,
Yes.
as long as we're willing to communicate and dialogue and work together.
Yeah, that's right. And that starts with, as I like to say, reading reality truthfully, which is why I didn't pull any punches about Marxism. Doesn't mean that if you've been flirting with that or you still find it appealing that I hate you, that we can't talk. But let's have the conversation. The point is, in fact, to do that and to have a certain optimism that comes from our supernatural optimism that as Catholics, we ought to be personifying every day.
Well, I want to thank you, Dr. Roberts, for sharing so much today. It's a fantastic presentation. We're recording this, and we're going to find some way to upload it to social media for those who didn't get to see it can learn. And I think you hopefully will send me some of those resources that you have, books by Ratzinger or whatnot, that we can share with others, so they can read more and learn more and get better prepared. I want to thank everybody for attending. Next week, we are going to be having a local banker, a parishioner, Mr. James Toops, who's going to be talking about the third way, and particularly the idea of distributism and some different sort of Catholic economic theories, so that we can better understand Catholic economic truth. And as I said last week, we are in the middle of our Ministry Partner Challenge, looking for people who are going to support work like this, these different educational, informative lectures and whatnot that we provide for the students and parishioners. If you'd like to be a monthly giver and support wisdom, just go to our webpage, ragingcajuncatholics.org/donate to be able to learn more. Thanks a lot, Dr. Roberts. And we look forward to seeing everyone else back next week. God bless.